So today we're talking about the Bible in Judaism, which of course these are all impossibly large topics, but hey, what the hell, we're just trying to survey the field. And of course the interesting point will be is how what happens to Hebrew Bible in Judaism is different from what happens to Hebrew Bible in Christianity, right? That's of course where we're going with the main point that will emerge from these two sessions. Okay, so let's start. I'm going to begin by just reminding you of the discussion of Daniel, which we had, and which I ended off by saying on the lecture notes then, that in Daniel we start to see many developments that will come to typify Judaism. I didn't have a chance to talk about that very much now, so I'm sort of piggybacking onto that and following up on that. Okay, but first I need to give you some names and dates, some survey of some history, just so we make sure we have context. So, we're talking about how Israelite religion, how the Hebrew Bible turns into Judaism. That's the subject for today. How the religion of the people of Israel becomes Judaism. That clearly is not an event, it's a process, and it's a complicated process, multi-pronged process. So we're going to try to pursue some of those themes. So here first are some key historical moments, just some key names and dates. 587 BC, Babylonian exile. You know that one, right? That's one should be in your repertoire. After the Babylonians come the Persians, right? Babylonian Empire comes to an end, succeeded by the Persian Empire. Babylonians were bad, destroyed the temple. Persians were good. They allowed the Judeans to return from Judea and to rebuild the temple, which is rededicated around the year 516, approximately the 70th year after the exile, as predicted by Jeremiah. This is review. Yes, it should sound familiar to you. Okay, 516 BC. Okay. Then we have the emergence of the Torah book is the next point I put down. This we did not discuss in class because we didn't have time to read the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. But according to most modern scholars, sometime in the Persian period, so that's 6th, 5th, 4th, let's say 5th, right in the middle, century BC, the emergence of the Torah book. When do J, P, E, D, H, etc., when do they lose their autonomy? When do they become part of a single large book that we now call the Torah, or the 5 books of Moses? When does that happen? Answer. The real answer is we don't know. Okay, I got that out of the way. Now we can continue. When does that happen? The most likely conjecture, the most likely hypothesis is that happens in the Persian period. And traditionally we associate that process with the name of Ezra, who is the eponymous figure of one of the books. Eponymous? Yes, Karina? Gives his name to. Excellent. Right. So the eponym of the book of Ezra is the man Ezra, right, who gives his name on the book of Ezra. So Ezra is a likely candidate as the man, Ezra the scribe, who put together those strands and created a book that closely resembles what we now call the Torah. If that's correct, that's dated in the 6th century BCE. 5th century BCE, in the 400s BCE. If it's not correct, then I would say, okay, it's not Ezra, it's somebody else, anonymous, probably around the same time. Why do I say that? Because of the next line. Because sometime in the 3rd century BCE, the Jews of Egypt translated the Torah into Greek. So by the 3rd century BCE, for sure, we not only have a Torah scroll, but we have a Torah book, but we have a Torah book, the first 5 books, Genesis through Deuteronomy. We have a Torah book which is already occupying a position as, technical term, a public book. A public book, i.e., it's not a book owned by, secreted away by the priests in some sacred treasure chest somewhere under the altar or in a cave or in a cabinet. No, it's a book out there that belongs to the people, and the people need to read it. But how do you do that if you don't know Hebrew? Answer, translate it into Greek. So that's what's implied by that event in the 3rd century BC. So therefore, by the 3rd century BC, you have to have a Torah book. So where did the Torah book come from? Well, now I think back, when's the most likely opportunity the Torah book will have emerged? Answer, Ezra, 5th century BC. Okay, so by the 3rd century BC, Jews outside the land of Israel don't know enough Hebrew to read the book in the original, right? They need help. In fact, even before that, Jews in the land of Israel needed help translating the Torah because their Hebrew wasn't good enough, because they didn't speak Hebrew anymore. They spoke Aramaic. Many Jews spoke Aramaic already in the Persian times. So we already have this process of translating. We'll come back to that. Okay, that's step 2 again. Synagogues appear in Egypt for the first time in the 3rd century BCE. What is a synagogue? A place of worship for Jewish people. Okay, I'll take that. Yeah, it's a place. That's the key thing. It's a place, not necessarily a building, because it'd be a place, right, where Jewish people gather. That's the literal meaning of the term. Sun means together or with. Agog, driving or bringing people together. So it's a place where Jews gather. What do they do when they gather there? They gather there to worship. What does worship mean in this context in a synagogue? It usually means one of 2 things. Either it means prayer, as we'll see shortly, or it means study. So the Jews of Egypt need a Torah in Greek so they can study it, because they don't know Hebrew, but they want to read the Torah in synagogue, but they can't do it in Hebrew, so therefore they'll do it in Greek. That's synagogue. These are places. The places ultimately become buildings and become distinctive buildings. First time we see that, 3rd century BC in Egypt. Not before. Also not in the land of Israel. It begins in Egypt. 2nd century BCE, we have the Hasmonean revolt. This is a very timely piece of information. Right? The Hasmoneans rebel against the Greek kings of Syria. Right? And why is that important for our purposes? Important for our purposes because this launches a period of extraordinary dynamism, creativity, and stress in the history of Judaism. Right? The wicked Greek kings tried to profane the temple. The righteous Hasmoneans, you see, that's a Hebrew school perspective on things. Reality, of course, is more complicated. Right? But the righteous Hasmoneans stand up against the wicked Greek kings. They reclaim the temple, purify it, and restore Judaism. And they do a lot of other things too. Anyway, that's the 2nd century BC, and that's why Jewish boys and girls eat foil-covered chocolate coins on Hanukkah. I'm not sure of the logic of that sentence, but somehow there's a connection. Right. Okay. Arrival of the Romans, 63 BC. This is already past our period. Just reminding you on your B's timeline from way back, just to give you some of this brief dates to put things in perspective. 63 BC, the Greek kings of Syria are now out of the way. Before then, the Persians are long since out of the way, and before then, the Babylonians even more so. I emphasize this sequence of empires because undergraduates always get confused. Aren't all these empires really all the same? No, they're not. These are the Romans. Don't confuse them with the Greeks. Don't confuse them with the Persians. Don't confuse them with the Babylonians. Okay? So the Romans come along in 63 BCE. Then we have interesting things going on, but that's beyond not our concern here. In this class, we have Jesus' activity in Judea in the 1st century of our era, probably in the 30s. We don't know the exact chronology, but that's the usual chronology, somewhere in the 30s CE. And destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. This we've mentioned already a few times. Second Temple destroyed 70 CE by the Romans. Not the Babylonians, right? By the Romans, right? That's 70 CE or 70 AD, if you insist. After the destruction of the temple, we have the emergence of Christianity, which I'm going to talk about on Wednesday. And we also have, listen carefully, class, we also have the emergence of Judaism. You have Judaism before, as we'll see shortly, but what becomes the distinctive Judaism, the kind of Judaism that will endure from antiquity to contemporary times, with lots and lots of changes and developments to be sure, but still a single continuous culture, right? That Judaism emerges also in the wake of the destruction of the temple in 70, and probably not before. We call that Judaism Rabbinic Judaism, rabbis or sages, because the term rabbi is the term that these people use in their own literature as a title of respect among themselves. So the term rabbi this, rabbi that, rabbi this, rabbi that appears all over the place in their literature. So by convention, for convenience, we call it rabbinic literature. Rabbinic literature emerges for the first time in the 2nd century CE, not before. Were there rabbis running around before that, you ask? I'm not sure. Depends how you define a rabbi, and it depends upon what you mean by running around. So, we have rabbis running around in the 2nd century CE, culminating in the appearance of the first rabbinic book, which is the Mishnah, around the year 200 CE. And don't get me started on the Mishnah, because I'll give you an hours-long lecture on the subject, which is one of my passionate interests in life, is the study of the Mishnah, but not here, not now. But the Mishnah is basically a law book, an anthology of laws, practices, rituals, customs, and the rest, debating among the sages about how to conduct these various rituals, practices, customs, and so on and so on. A very large book, around 1,000 pages in English. That's the Mishnah, the first rabbinic book. Okay, that was a very, very, very brief survey of some important names and dates. The destruction of the temple by the Romans was provoked by a rebellion by the Jews of Judea. Now, why did the Jews of Judea rebel? Answer, they had grievances real and imagined. And they didn't actually rebel. They had some riots, and the riots get out of hand, and then before you know it, it turns around, it turns out there's a rebellion on their hands. That's the story. The Christians, as far as we know, were not involved in any intimate way. When the war broke out, according to Christian tradition in Eusebius, they fled to a city across the Jordan to get out of town. So they had nothing to do with the rebellion. Although when the rebellion is over and the temple is destroyed and the Jews lie defeated, the Christians say, "Told you so." Told you so for what? Jews rejected Christ, so God rejects the Jews. Okay, that's already in the Gospel of Matthew. What I just said is not in so many words, but implicitly it's in the Gospel of Matthew. Okay, so I've given you a brief chronological survey. Somewhere on these turbulent centuries, the last 5 centuries, BCE, 1st century CE, somewhere in there, in this very turbulent period, you can see the gradual but very perceptible emergence of something we might call Judaism out of what we might call the religion, society, and culture of the Hebrew Bible. I repeat, in this class, I've been very careful never to refer to the people of the Bible as Jews. I've been very careful never to refer to the religion and culture of the Hebrew Bible as Judaism. Right? Because I think one can make very meaningful historical distinctions between this, which is not Judaism, and this, which is Judaism. Well, that's what we're going to do now. Right? To do compare and contrast. Okay, or in other words, continuity and discontinuity between what we call in Judaism and what I'm calling the religion and culture of the Hebrew Bible. So here we go. Israelite society and religion. The Hebrew Bible, Israelite society and religion. We have kings, prophets, temple, sacrifices, and land. I'm going to use those as my headings to compare and contrast what we have before, what we have after. So, in Jewish society and religion, we no longer have a king. We no longer have a king. What happened to the king? What happened to royal? What happened to the monarchy? When does the Israelite monarchy come to an end? 587 BCE, the Judah is exiled, and the Judean kings are exiled also, and they persist for a couple more generations, but fundamentally by the end of the 6th century BC, they're gone. Right? There is no longer any kings. There is no longer a king. So we have the disappearance of monarchy, which had been a very important feature of the society of the Judean and Israelite peoples. Right? That disappears. And who emerges as in charge? Well, during the last centuries BCE, after the monarchy disappears, priests emerge as they come out of the temple, and priests emerge not only as officers in the temple, which of course they always had been, but also as political officers. Priests remained very prominent throughout the last centuries BCE in Judea. After 70 CE, priests, Jews named Cohen, right, have to go to work. That's why I'm sitting here before you. Otherwise, I'd be off in the temple in Jerusalem getting fat based on offerings of Israelite farmers. I don't have to do anything, right? But instead, I need a day job, right? Because priests are out of a job, and after 70 CE, the priesthood gradually becomes just a mark of genealogical distinction, right? But other than that, it doesn't mean anything anymore, right? We have the emergence of a new group, sages, otherwise known as rabbis. So that's the end of kings. So Israelite society, I would say, is characterized by the importance of kings. Kings are important also because kings go with the temple. Who built the temple? David, Solomon. And kings are also closely associated with prophets. Kings and prophets come along. Remember, we had prophets at the court of the king. Then we have non-institutional prophets who are always in opposition to the king. So there's some connection, both positive and negative, between the kingship and prophecy and temple. 587, temple is gone, kingship is gone, and shortly thereafter, prophecy is gone. Remember the last literary prophets, the last prophets of the Hebrew Bible for whom we have books, texts, are from the, which period class? That's right, they're from the Persian period. Right, the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. Malachi is not really a name, but whatever. Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, these are the prophets who are active in the Persian period. Do we have any biblical books, class, which explicitly acknowledge that they come from a period later than the Persian period? No. Let's do that again, this time be more assertive. Do we have any books in the Hebrew Bible explicitly acknowledge that they come from a period after the Persian period? No. Thank you. So Persian period, you can see then, is something big is going on. We have a major transition in authority, the nature of religious authority. Kings are gone, priests are gone, temple will persist, it is rebuilt, but the second temple was never quite the same as the first temple. But that'll be a different discussion. Okay, so we no longer have literary prophets running around writing books or declaiming these fantastic speeches and this wonderfully incomprehensible poetry in which they talk about God and the world and sin and punishment and the nations and the future and the present and all those things that prophets do. They don't do that anymore. So class, what is an Israelite, or perhaps we could say a Jew, to do? How am I going to hear the word of the Lord when literary prophets don't exist anymore? They're gone. They're from a previous time. So how do I hear the word of the Lord? Or, another way to put it would be, I can't keep adding to the Torah anymore because the Torah is closed. It's been edited. It's emerged as a public book. So how do I divine God's will? I can't keep modifying the book. Answer, what we have is the emergence of Scripture. Books. You want to hear the word of the Lord? Well, there are no more Jeremiahs out there, but you read the book of Jeremiah. Study the words of Jeremiah. You want to know the Lord's instructions? Well, we've gotten past J and P and D. Now you study the Torah. So we have the emergence of Scripture. We have the emergence of biblical books, or we might call canonical books. Go back to something we discussed at the very beginning of this course. And we have the emergence of the Bible, or in pieces. First the Torah, and then prophets, and then further additions. But we have, starting in the Persian period, the early post-Persian period, the mysterious Greek period of the Greek kings, we have the emergence of a Torah book, we have the emergence of scripture, we have the emergence of interpretation. We derive meanings not through new revelations, we derive new meanings through new study, through interpretation. In addition to the canonization of these old books and study of them, we have during these centuries a very large literature, which is not directly our concern. We have apocalypses, we have pseudepigraphy, we have apocryphal books. Okay, these are good multisyllabic words you can casually use in conversation with your friends, and they will be extremely impressed. So therefore, they're well worth becoming familiar with these terms. Right. So what are apocalypses? Apocalypses literally mean revelations. Apocalypse is Greek, revelation is Latin. Right. So revelations in which some seer reveals, or often it is revealed to him. An angel is revealing to him some secrets, and he's writing it down. And the book that we read is an apocalyptic book, right, which reveals some deep secrets about how God runs the world. The end time usually is the theme of these books, perhaps the Messiah, perhaps big battle scenes, perhaps the triumph of good over evil, or perhaps the temporary victory of evil over good, only to be followed by the inevitable victory of good over evil. Battle scenes, angels, why is the world in such a terrible crisis? Answer, because we're tottering on the brink of the precipice, or about to tip over. Right? These are typical themes in works that we call apocalypses. So in addition to the biblical books, Jews are writing other books during these centuries. And apocalypses is a very characteristic genre of the last centuries BCE and first century CE. We'll come back to this. We'll talk about Christianity in greater detail. Something called pseudepigraphy, right? You write books that false, epigraphy, ascription. They have false ascriptions. Again, pseudepigraphy is Greek, ascription is Latin. So false ascriptions, right? It says that this is the revelation of Shem, son of Noah. Trust me on this. Shem, son of Noah, never came anywhere near this book. Or the book of Enoch. Enoch, that's that antediluvian figure in the book of Genesis, right? And that figure of Enoch never went anywhere near this book. But some ancient Jew wrote a book and stuck the name Enoch on it. That's called pseudepigraphy. Why did they do this? I don't know. But they did. So we have a rich and abundant literature that is produced by Jews in antiquity, but nonetheless we need to keep track of the fact that this is accompanied by the emergence of the Torah book, the emergence of the prophet books. In other words, the emergence of what you and I might call a Bible. Some books are in the Bible, and some books wind up outside the Bible. That looks like Judaism to me. It's hard to see this phenomenon, this literary phenomenon, in the time of Israelite religion, Israelite society. We have the emergence of the Torah book. We also have the emergence of the Torah book. We also gradually get the emergence of a sacred object. When does the Torah scroll emerge as a sacred object? That's a fascinating question, which I've looked into, and I don't quite have the answer yet. It is somewhere in the last centuries BCE, the first time I get evidence for the idea not just that the text is sacred because the text comes from God, but that the object on which the ink is written, that object is now also is a locus of sanctity or holiness. And ultimately it'll come out to look like this. Here you have, I'm sure you've seen these. Even if you don't go to synagogue, you've seen photos. Right? This is what a Torah scroll looks like. But these are big scrolls because they have all 5 books are on one giant scroll. Presumably, originally, each Torah book, each of the 5 books, was originally its own scroll. That's why it's called Pentateuch. Penta, 5, and tuch is the Greek for roll. So 5 rolls, 5 scrolls. But we have now, at least now in our liturgical usage, all 5 books are put on together and two wooden rollers at either end, because it's a very, very large and very heavy book. But this book then becomes itself an object of veneration. This is characteristic of Judaism. I don't know whether Christians ever actually venerated Christian books quite the same way. I need to look into this further. And certainly Muslims do, but Muslims have venerated the printed book. This is a very interesting subject. I need to get to the bottom of it. I don't know of a good study of it, a comparative study. But in any case, sometime in the last centuries BCE, the Torah book emerges as a sacred book, and then the scroll itself becomes a sacred artifact. When you read the Torah scroll in synagogue, you don't touch the text. Because again, the artifact is sacred. The parchment, the leather, the ink. You don't touch it. You only point to it with a pointer. Let's go back to Rabbinic Judaism, or the Judaism that will emerge in the centuries after 70. One of the important things about Judaism that emerges after 70 CE, the rabbis, the sages, is their Judaism is biblicistic. They focus on the Hebrew Bible, and on the Hebrew Bible, they focus mostly on the Torah. And all those other books not in the Bible, all those apocalypses out there, all those pseudepigraphs, all those apocryphal books, all those books written by Jews in Greek, Philo, Josephus, books of Maccabees, all those books, the rabbis ignore. They pay no attention. They don't exist. The rabbis see themselves as the direct, unintermediated continuators of the Torah, in the sense that the Torah is here, and we are studying the Torah. And everything else that came in between, we couldn't care less. We ignore. And when they do study the Bible, the Torah is the book that emerges far and away as the most important book. We want to understand what God wants us to do. We want to understand how we should behave. What is our self-conception? Where do we come from? Answer, you don't study history books, you study the Torah. You don't study, other works of law, you study the Torah. So Rabbinic Judaism, as it emerges in the 2nd century CE, is overwhelmingly Torah-centric. I'll come back to this at the end of today. It is overwhelmingly Torah-centric. Oh yeah, we read the prophets also. Oh yeah, we read other books. Yeah, of course, they're sacred, they're important, of course. But at the end of the day, it's the Torah that matters in rabbinic piety. You can see simply by the number of quotations, allusions, references to it. Here, David Stern has a nice essay which I ask you to look at in the JSB on different kinds of rabbinic scriptural interpretation. And he gives you a very nice survey of showing how the rabbis read the Torah, or read the Bible in general and the Torah in particular. One last point, post-70 CE, doctrine of the oral Torah. The rabbis pull a fast one on us, because not only are they subservient to the Torah by their own self-declaration, not only do they see the Torah as the encapsulation of divine revelation, this is where we look to hear the word of God, but the rabbis also invent, I've used the word advisedly, the rabbis also invent a vehicle which allows them room to maneuver, is how I like to put it. While of course we owe fealty to the Torah, but we owe fealty to the Torah not directly. We have a little room to negotiate. That's what we call the oral Torah, which I think I spoke about here briefly once, did I not, in the beginning of this course? If I did, you've all forgotten it. So I'll go back to it again. Oral Torah. Namely, the theory is that when Moses came down from Mount Sinai, he had on the one shoulder the Torah, the 5 scrolls, the Pentateuch, but he also brought with him, on his other shoulder as it were, he brought with him the oral Torah, another body of law and lore and interpretation, no less authoritative, but it was not written. It was not oral. So if you say, it was oral. So if you say, well, where is it then? Answer. That's the point. You can't. It's not here. It's oral. I can't show it to you. Except that we rabbis are the repository of that oral Torah which Moses brought down from Mount Sinai alongside the written Torah. And the oral Torah allows us, here's the key exegetical move here, the oral Torah allows us to interpret the written Torah. So, class, does the written Torah, what we simply call the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, does the Torah mean what it says? It says what it means? No, the answer, of course, is no, of course not. It just appears to say something, but of course it really means something else. In other words, the text requires interpretation. In other words, the interpreter is king over the text. In other words, we declare our lifelong fealty to the Torah, all the while we can turn around and master the Torah by interpreting it. That maneuver is called the oral Torah. And that is something which you cannot find anywhere in ancient Judaism, that conceptualization of an oral Torah, the idea that Moses brought a written Torah and alongside it a body of modes of interpretation, exegesis, laws, customs, etc., which supplement and, to be honest, ladies and gentlemen, occasionally supplants the written Torah, you cannot find that anywhere else in ancient Judaism. That is something quintessentially rabbinic and something quintessentially post-70 CE. Or, in other words, that's Judaism. Do Christians have an oral Torah? Trick question. I would say no. They don't have an oral Torah by which they read the Hebrew Bible, the Torah. They have something called the New Testament, which also intermediates between themselves and the text. They read the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, through the New Testament. And the rabbis read the Torah through the oral Torah. All right, mull that over for 2 days. We'll come back to that on Wednesday. So, we're doing compare and contrast. You see how Israelite religion begins with the Bible, but Judaism, as it turns out, is something qualitatively different from it. That's where we're going with this. Synagogues. Synagogues emerged during the last centuries BCE. Are synagogues mentioned anywhere in the Torah, class? No. Absolutely not. Is synagogal piety mentioned in the Bible, in the Torah? Again, I'll focus on the Torah. Synagogal piety, the idea that you should regularly worship the Lord through prayer, is that anywhere in the Torah? No. The Torah, of course, wants you to study the words of the Torah. That's especially Deuteronomy, quintessentially Deuteronomistic. You should study the Torah. But the idea that you are studying Torah communally as a regular act of worship, not just to know what the law is so you'll be good boys and girls and do what you're supposed to do and avoid doing those things you shouldn't be doing, but rather the act of study is itself an act of worship of the Lord, that is very hard to find. I don't think it's in the Torah anywhere. You probably find it in some wisdom psalms, most notably Psalm 119, which is by far the longest and most boring of all the psalms. But in Psalm 119, you do find something like this. I would call that a transitional mode, where the act of study is itself an act of worship of the Lord. Reading the Lord's words, reading the instructions of the Lord is a delight. Supplies spiritual energy or communion. That is, again, part and parcel of synagogal piety, and that is quintessentially Judaism. Scriptural study. The Torah looms very large in the synagogal service. This is discussed in a very nice article by Avigdor Shinan in one of the essays I asked you to look at for today. There is a lectionary cycle, or election, right, in which the Torah service consists not just of prayer. Many of those prayers, by the way, come from the Psalms, right, which we've discussed already. Prayer, the synagogal service also consists of reading. That's what lection means. Lection, Latin, reading. That there is a cycle in which you regularly read from at a certain central point in the service in the synagogue. One reads from the Torah. Literally, it is read, or actually it is sung. You read it out. We read this piece, and we come back again next Sabbath, we read the next piece. And the Sabbath after that, we read the next piece. And so on, over a period of time. There are different ways of calculating it, right? You would read through the entire Torah from one end to the other. And what do you do when you finish reading it? What do you do when you finish reading it? You start over again. And you keep reading through it a little bit at a time. Right? That's a lectionary cycle. So the Torah as a sacred book emerges then as a central part of synagogal piety. Synagogal piety consists not just of prayer, but of study of the book. Because when you read the Torah, do you read the Torah naked, bare, just read the scripture in antiquity? No, of course not. You probably had a translation to go along with it, because some people, not everybody knows Hebrew. I know it's hard to contemplate, but yeah, in antiquity, not all Jews knew Hebrew. Right, so you may want to translate it into Greek. You may want to translate it into Aramaic. And some learned person may want to stand up and give a little sermon. That's where sermons come from. It's part and parcel of teaching the Torah, not just reading it, but studying it. All this becomes part and parcel of synagogal piety. You find none of this anywhere in the Hebrew Bible. You only find anticipations of it in the Hebrew Bible, but this becomes quintessentially hallmarks of Judaism. Okay, more compare and contrast. I already mentioned the fact we don't have a king. So here I say we have quietism instead of land and independence. What makes Judaism Judaism, in part, is distance from the land. Political independence is gone. When did political independence disappear? Disappeared under the Babylonians. When the Judeans came back under the Persians, were they an independent state? No. They were a province of the Persian Empire. When the Persian Empire fell and the Greek monarchies came along, was Judea an independent state? No. They were provinces of Greek empires. Only for a very brief interruption under the Hasmoneans do we have a century, more or less, of independence. Otherwise, in antiquity, Judeans are always and only under the reign of foreign kings. When the Romans came along, it's part of the Roman Empire. In the biblical piety, of course, inheriting the land and having your own government on the land seems to be a very part and parcel of Israelite identity, especially notions of kingship. But in the last centuries BCE, kingship disappears, political independence disappears, and instead what replaces it is an attitude of political quietism. Quietism. Hey, Jews, be quiet. Live peaceably under your foreign overlords. And the God will take care of them in his own way at his own time. Who's the prophet of quietism? Jeremiah. Excellent. Jeremiah 29. Jeremiah chapter 29, a very important chapter in history of Jewish political thought. God put empires over you. In turn, you accept the rule of the empires and wait. In the meantime, you pray for the health and welfare of the empire under which you live. Okay, so we have more Jewish things. Emergence of communal identity markers, right, by which the Jews become distinctive vis-a-vis other peoples. And most of these distinctive hallmarks go back to the Hebrew Bible, but they have new functions. They function now as community markers or as markers of Jewish identity. Let's go to the next one, the theological one, which is an important one for Wednesday. Reward and punishment. In the Hebrew Bible, especially in the Torah, where does God reward the righteous and punish the wicked? Is it in some mysterious afterlife? Or is it part and parcel of this life in which we are to be found? Afterlife or this life? Which one is it, class? This life. Right. The Hebrew Bible is overwhelmingly focused on its emphasis on divine justice, which is a major theme in the Hebrew Bible, right? That God is righteous and rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked appropriately, right? But this is overwhelmingly understood to take place in this world. Again, there are different theories about how it works, especially about extending it through generations across time, and especially about synchronic punishment, whether everybody suffers because of the sins of some. We've discussed some of this. Especially the prophets are much exercised by these problems. The two famous chapters of Jeremiah and Ezekiel about whether God punishes a sinner directly or not. Fine. So there is a divergent legacy on this question. But fundamental, and Job does not have available to him the answer, well, gee, I guess I'll get rewarded in the next life. No, that's not an option. Right. So that the Hebrew Bible is overwhelmingly focused on reward and punishment in this world. By the time you get to what we call Judaism and also Christianity, as we'll see on Wednesday, is the system of divine justice focused on this world or on the next? Answer is it's on the next. As the rabbis say, this world is but an entranceway, a hallway leading to the next world. The real reality, real existence is in the next world. Because this world is temporary. You're here and you die. How long are you here for? Whatever it is, it's temporary. Right. Permanent, real existence is understood to be in the next world. This is an idea you find both in Judaism and in Christianity alike. And a whole large and very complex series of beliefs are associated with it. Resurrection of the dead, or reward and punishment in the hereafter, heaven and hell, Messiah, end of days, final judgment scene. These are a very large and complicated series of beliefs. Philosophical people didn't believe in resurrection of the body. They thought that was too gross. After all, philosophers spend their entire lifetime trying to escape the body. Right. So philosopher types like immortality of the soul. The body is shed, the body is corrupt, and it is the soul which is immortal. The soul which is eternal. So both Jews and Christian philosopher types like that, but both Jews and Christians non-philosopher types thought getting back the body sounded like a good thing to them. So for many of them, the resurrection of the body meant, God damn it, it meant the body. Especially if the body had suffered in this world, then the body should have a little pleasure in the next world. Okay, I'll come back to the issue, though, of cosmic monism and so on. Even though we have these very strong beliefs in Judaism of reward and punishment in the hereafter, right? For most Jewish thinkers, this does not turn into a dualistic system where this world is under the control of evil forces and the next world is where God finally gets his moment. No, for most Jewish thinkers, even this world, all of its pain and suffering and travail, right, is somehow not under the thumb of wicked hostile powers. It is still mysteriously, oh so mysteriously, part of a single divine plan. That's what we mean by monism. Some Jews already in the last centuries BC had begun to develop a dualistic system. Right? This world is under the control of evil forces, evil powers. God lets them have sway because never could quite answer that one. But God, anyway, temporarily lets them, these evil forces, dominions, elements, have power over us. But in the end of time, God's going to come and really going to lay them low, and then you'll be happy you're on the right team. So you find that's already in some Jewish texts, notably apocalyptic texts. But in the post-70 period, in the Judaism of the rabbis that emerges in the post-70 period, that kind of thinking is hard to find. The more common thinking is we accept what God dishes out to us in this world for reasons that are best known to God, which we don't understand, but we are confident, we are sure that in the next world, in the next existence, everything will work out. God's justice is something we can rely upon and be confident about. Bottom line. So, I've given you now 45 minutes worth of compare and contrast. The Hebrew Bible and Israelite religion over here is different. What's going to turn into Judaism, especially Judaism after 70 CE, this is different. key point. And then with this I stop. Yes, it's different. However, they didn't think so. The ancient Jews, especially the rabbis, thought that they are the same as Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, David, Solomon, that they're really all the same. I don't know what level of historical self-awareness they have, but whatever level it is small. They are confident that we rabbis, we Jews, we are the same people as those who left Egypt under Moses, who wandered in the desert, who received the Torah. That's us. And that's an important point because the Christians have a far more complicated answer to that question. Is that us? Well, yes, no, maybe, depends. That we'll talk about more on Wednesday. Okay, everybody, hope to see you on Wednesday.